And Aziza, I think people are coming into the room, so you could start at any point now.
Okay, thank you. Hello, everyone, and thank you for joining us on this press conference, on the ruling released earlier today by the International Court of Justice on the Gaza genocide case. I'm Aziza Kanji, legal academic and journalist, and I'm moderating this press conference on behalf of the organizers, Just Peace Advocates and the Canadian Foreign Policy Institute. In today's ruling, the International Court of Justice held that Israel's actions committed in Gaza since October 7th plausibly violate the Genocide Convention and ordered several emergency provisional measures, including that Israel prevent and ensure that the Israeli military not commit genocidal killings, deprivation of life necessities, and other acts falling within the prohibited ambit of the Genocide Convention, that Israel prevent and punish genocidal incitement, that it ensure adequate humanitarian access and preservation of evidence, and that it regularly report back to the court on the implementation of these provisional measures. In reaction, Israeli officials have tweeted Haig Schmeig and described the decision as an act of quote unquote blatant discrimination. To discuss the ruling and implications for Canada, given Canada's own international legal obligations to prevent and stop genocide under the Genocide Convention, we are joined by the High Commissioner of South Africa to Canada, Riaz Sheikh, Palestine Ambassador Mona Abu Amara, former UN Special Rapporteur on Palestine, Michael Link, Canada Director of Human Rights Watch, Farida Daif, and filmmaker and activist, Avi Lewis. We're going to start by hearing from all of our speakers very briefly before we take questions from the press. Since we do have a mixed audience of press and public, we would ask that any journalists here please identify your media affiliation either in your Zoom name or in a private message to us so that we can be sure to prioritize your questions. For any other questions that people might have, we are also having a public seminar on international law and Palestine for everyone, so you can ask your questions to the international legal experts then. South Africa's High Commissioner to Canada, Riaz Sheikh.
Well, thank you for giving us the opportunity to express our reaction to the judgment. But before I do that, So we welcome the decision. We think it is a remarkable, strong judgment. We think we have established the case that there is plausible genocide occurring. And we think that now the time for action has arisen. We are extremely mindful that as of today, every minute, every action that Israel commits in perpetuation of genocidal intent or plausible genocide, they would have to account for it to the court in 30 days' time. So the clock is ticking, and our advice to the state of Israel is to implement the measures of the court. And those measures include, although they did not express it specifically, it includes a ceasefire. All measures includes a ceasefire. So our advice to the Israeli government, to the state of Israel, is to desist from any further military action and start the process for peace today. There were many politicians from various parts of the world who argued that South Africa's case is meritless. In fact, they argued that it was legally absurd. Well, the International Court of Justice found that we were correct in bringing the case before the International Court. They have upheld jurisdiction on the matter. They have upheld South Africa's local standing on the matter. And therefore, it's now incumbent on those politicians to publicly admit that they were wrong. And secondly, they have to do so because those statements that they issued in the past will stand as evidence of complicity in plausible genocide. I thank you very much, and I will take questions.
Thank you, High Commissioner Sheikh. Ambassador Abu Amara.
Today, allow me to speak as a Palestinian before being a diplomat, ambassador, chief representative, and be the voice for the voiceless, the millions of Palestinians who not only suffered and are still suffering unconscionable atrocities perpetrated by a ruthless occupier, atrocities that people of the world should never be faced with, not to mention be live streamed while the rest of the world unfortunately went with its business as usual. Today, the ICJ affirmed in its ruling, and more so in the explanation that led to that ruling, that the 25,000 plus martyrs and thousands still under the rubble weren't massacred for self-defense. They weren't butchered because it was a necessity. Every soul lost after today is declared as a violation to the court's orders. Tens of thousands of Palestinian deaths and injuries, or martyrs, or sick, hungry, cold, amputated Palestinians and those under the rubble have forced the international community's highest court to declare that Palestinian blood is not cheap. They're not collateral damage, and we're not dispensable. Declaring that the risk of irreparable breaches of genocide convention in Gaza is imminent and plausible affirms what the Palestinians have been telling the international community for decades. Israel has been committing genocide, ethnic cleansing, and forcible displacement against the Palestinians since its inception. Israel has been unapologetically committing genocide. Yet, unfortunately, the same people who created international law and the forums that guaranteed its enforcement have repeatedly shielded Israel from accountability. Today, the highest court of justice has spoken, and Palestinians are asking the steadfast allies of Israel, especially Canada, will you listen? Today, the court has broken the taboo and is calling on states to adhere to its responsibilities to prevent genocide. We call on Canada to be the leader and champion of the international rules-based order, and as a defender of human rights, of women's rights, of children's rights, to practice what it preaches, even if those in danger are Palestinians, and even when the perpetrators is Israel. We call on Canada to end its regarding of Palestinians as an exception to the protection of the international order, and Israel as the exception to adhering to international law. We call on Canada to stop the arms sale to Israel, to stop communicating with those who incite genocide against our people, and stop trade of goods with those who want and declare every single day that they want to wipe out the Palestinian people. Today was a test to the international morals and legal structure. It won, but the question remains, will it be justice of the mighty and dictated peace that will never bring justice nor peace, or will the rule of law win? This is a win for the tortured people in Palestine, for our culture, for history, and our roots. And we could have never been able to be here without you. We could have never had the ability to stand tall and say, we have this right to hold Israel accountable and end this impunity. Without your bravery, your morals, we would have never seen this day. And this day is the beginning of a new era, the beginning of the end, hopefully, to the occupation and apartheid. Thank you so much.
Thank you, Ambassador Abu Amara. Michael Link, former UN Special Rapporteur on Human Rights in Palestine and Professor Emeritus of International Law at Western University.
Thank you very much for this opportunity to join this press conference. I think this ruling is remarkable for three reasons, which I'll lay out. First of all, by an overwhelming vote, the votes on the various measures were either 15-2 or 16-1 among the judges. The International Court of Justice accepted South Africa's legal argument that there was a plausible case of genocide being committed by Israel's military actions since October in Gaza. The court put a great deal of emphasis on a number of statements being made by leading UN officials, including the UN Secretary General Antonio Guterres, that Israel's operations had resulted in a humanitarian catastrophe in Gaza. They noted that the 25,000 plus dead in Gaza, the more than 60,000 Palestinians wounded, the large areas of Gaza that have been flattened, including civilian infrastructure. It also made reference to statements which would indicate genocidal intent by leading Israeli political figures, including the president of Israel, the Israeli defense minister, and the now Israeli foreign minister were specifically cited by the court with regards to this. And they said that made out a plausible case of genocidal intent, all of which will then be part of the evidence that will go into a court hearing on the merits of the genocide allegations sometime in the next couple of years. Secondly, there were very strong provisional measures that were ordered by the court. First of all, Israel has to do everything within its power to stop the killing of the protected group, the Palestinians in Gaza. It has to stop causing serious bodily and mental harm. Israel has to stop deliberately inflicting on the group conditions of life calculated to bring about its physical destruction. It has to allow unhindered humanitarian aid that will meet the needs of the population in Gaza. It's directed the Israeli authorities, particularly the Attorney General, to investigate reports of dehumanizing and genocidal intent language used by Israeli political and military leaders. And it's also ordered, obviously, the release of all remaining Israeli hostages being held by Hamas in Gaza. It did not, I want to note, order a ceasefire, and Israel may argue that all of its actions are and continue to be within the guardrails of international law, and that it will continue its military assault as per usual. But I would say that there's no way that Israel can wind up fulfilling the provisional orders that have been mentioned, particularly with respect to the order that it has to do everything within its power to stop the killing of members of the protected group, except through a ceasefire. And I would point out that the court also reminded everybody that the order it's issuing is legally binding. And the third and final point I want to make is that with respect to Canada, there have been three orders issued by the International Court of Justice over the last 2 years. One regarding Myanmar, a second regarding Russia and Ukraine, and a third regarding Syria, where the International Court of Justice has issued provisional measures. And in each of those three cases, Canada said, we reiterate that, in this case, Myanmar must comply with the ICJ's provisional measures order. Canada said, with respect to Ukraine, we welcome the court's ruling for provisional measures and strongly urge Russia to comply with this legally binding order. The ICJ, Canada said, is a pillar of the rules-based international order. And with respect to Syria, Canada said, together with the Netherlands, we welcome this decision of the court to indicate provisional measures with respect to use of torture in Syria. The order issued today is binding on Syria. It must now immediately implement these provisional measures. So I would call upon Canada to do exactly the same thing with respect to this order today coming from the ICJ, as it's done and agreed to with respect to Myanmar, Russia, and Syria. And the very last point I'll make is, I said that the orders are not legally binding. Sorry, they are legally binding, but there's no enforcement measurement by the ICJ itself. That will now go to the United Nations Security Council. And then the spotlight will be on the United States as whether it will issue a fourth veto with respect to a call by for an immediate humanitarian ceasefire in Gaza. Recall that the last time there was a vote on this, on the 22nd of December, the vote in favor of a humanitarian ceasefire by the Security Council was 13 to 1, with the United Kingdom abstaining and the United States vetoing this. I think the pressure, hopefully in the aftermath of this ruling, will be to put the United States in a position where it has to tell its ally Israel to stop the war.
Thank you, Professor Link. Farida Daif, Canada Director of Human Rights Watch.
Thank you so much. The International Court of Justice, the principal judicial organ of the United Nations, delivered a landmark decision today. The court essentially made clear to not only Israel, but also its allies, that immediate action is needed to prevent genocide and further atrocities against Palestinians in Gaza. The speed of the court's ruling only underscores a recognition of the dire situation where civilians face starvation and are being killed daily at levels unprecedented in the recent history of this conflict. Notably, the court found that it was critical to adopt these urgent measures in order to protect the rights claimed by South Africa that the court found to be plausible, including the right of Palestinians in Gaza to be protected from acts of genocide. The provisional orders require Israel to essentially do 5 things: prevent and not commit any acts under the Genocide Convention, prevent and punish incitement to genocide by its officials, ensure the provision of humanitarian aid and basic needs to Palestinians in Gaza, prevent the destruction and ensure the preservation of evidence related to this case, and report back on its progress within 1 month. Fundamentally, measures that would protect civilians, ensure compliance with international law, and seek to prevent further suffering. The case brought by South Africa provides a critical opportunity for the International Court of Justice to provide clear, definitive answers on the question of whether Israel is committing genocide against the Palestinian people. The severity and the gravity of the abuses committed in Gaza warrant this level of scrutiny. Allegations of genocide or any atrocity crime only underline the importance of independent and impartial investigations. As we've said at Human Rights Watch again and again, governments, including Canada, should publicly and unequivocally support this process. The court's clear and binding orders raise the stakes for Canada and Israel's other allies to back up their stated commitment to a global rule-based order by helping ensuring compliance with this ruling. The court found that there's a plausible risk of genocide, so states are required under the Genocide Convention to take actions to prevent genocide and, of course, not to be complicit in its commission. It cannot be business as usual, both for Israel and its allies, following this landmark decision. Canada should urgently use its leverage to ensure that the court's orders are enforced by the State of Israel. Both the Prime Minister and Minister Joly should push Israel both privately and publicly to comply with the provisional measures and state unequivocally that Canada expects the full, immediate, and effective implementation of these orders, as the European Union has just done. Canada has historically been a leading voice for international accountability. It played a central role in establishing the International Criminal Court and has championed efforts at the International Court of Justice on Syria, Myanmar, and Ukraine. The Canadian government's position on Israel-Palestine departs gravely from Canada's storied legacy of action to prevent and address international crimes, but it's not too late to reverse course. Prime Minister Trudeau can choose to act and not be a silent bystander to atrocities. He can choose to advance justice and accountability for serious international crimes. The government can choose to engage in an impartial and principled manner. Thank you.
Thank you, Farida Daif. And now our last speaker, Avi Lewis, filmmaker and associate professor at the University of British Columbia, where he is also a member of the Jewish Faculty Network.
Thank you. I'm honored once again to be among these luminaries on such an important day. a day on which the International Court of Justice has ruled that there is a plausible case of genocide for Israel to answer. This is enormously significant, and I want to highlight three specific constituencies for whom this day is an historic turning point. This is a turning point for the peace movement, for millions of people around the world who have been watching in horror as atrocities pour across their screens, who have been taking to the streets in massive numbers around the world for 112 days now. This is a moment of validation. Believe your eyes. These horrors are not talking points or propaganda. They are real lives snuffed out, real crimes of mass starvation, displacement, and slaughter. The moral outrage, the demand for ceasefire, have been validated by the highest court in human society. Now is the time to double down on mobilizing, protesting, disrupting the status quo, bringing the catastrophe home for all governments in all countries. It's a long-awaited moment of accountability for Israel, not just for the ongoing crimes in Gaza, but for the entire system of illegal occupation, apartheid, dehumanization, and oppression of Palestinians. It's a moment that disrupts Israel's impunity and isolates Israel internationally, putting a significant new level of pressure on its allies and defenders in the international arena. And that includes Canada. This is a turning point for Canada, a moment of truth in our country. As a signatory to the Convention on Genocide, Canada must not support or enable a country that may be engaging in the most heinous acts of which humanity is capable. We cannot support and enable a country being tried for genocide. We currently have a trade deal with a country being tried for genocide. We sell weapons to a country being tried for genocide. We give diplomatic support at the UN. We welcome members of the military. We grant charitable tax status to groups that advocate for a country being tried for genocide. And all of this should stop immediately. Legally, Canada is legally exposed unless there's a major shift in our foreign policy towards Israel. Any country in the world can now take Canada to the International Court of Justice and accuse us of aiding and abetting a country which is being tried for genocide. So every act of Canada's government must now take into account this turning point in foreign affairs. And finally, speaking as a Jewish person, this is a turning point for Jewish people everywhere. This is a somber and truly historic moment. Many Jews have long criticized the actions of the state of Israel. Many of us have been saying not in our name for years, and with massively increased urgency for the last 112 days. But many Jewish people still have a deep visceral connection to the idea of a Jewish state, and there are many myths that have long persisted. This is a turning point for those myths, that Israel is a light unto the nations, that the Israeli military is the most moral army in the world, that Israel is a guarantee that there will never again be another Holocaust. Remember, the Convention on Genocide itself emerged from the ashes of the 6 million, of the Shoah, of the genocide against Jews. The state of Israel itself emerged from that historic horror. It's incredibly painful for some Jews to acknowledge that Israel is now a country being tried for genocide, but today this is an indisputable fact. So for Jewish people everywhere, for Canadians, for people around the world who are on fire for peace, this is a turning point, a time to get on the right side of history and demand a ceasefire now, an end to arms sales and diplomatic support to Israel, and an end to the occupation and the dismantling of apartheid in Palestine. Thank you.
Thank you, Avi Lewis, and greatest thanks to all of our speakers. Just Peace Advocates and Canadian Foreign Policy Institute, in order for Canada to fulfill its obligations to prevent and stop genocide, are calling for Canada to withdraw all forms of military, financial, moral, political support for the genocide, including by first, suspending permits for arms sales to Israel, second, pausing bilateral military ties, third, by revoking the charitable status of charities violating the Canada Revenue Agency by rules by assisting the Israeli military, fourth, by announcing an investigation into Canadians fighting in Gaza, and fifth, by condemning the genocide. Now we'll move to questions from media. Any journalists who are here who have questions, please do just raise your hand and identify your media outlet and we'll call on you. And for others who are here who have questions, a reminder that you can ask them in the seminar that we'll be having on international law and Palestine on Wednesday. We'll start with Dylan Robertson from Canadian Press. Dylan.
Hi, thank you for taking our questions here. My question is for both Ambassador Abu Amara and the High Commissioner Sheikh. I'm just wondering what communication you've had with the government over this case and what kind of response you heard when you raised this.
You're muted. High Commissioner Sheikh. Yes, you're good now.
Yes. Recently, in the past few days, we did have a consultation with the Canadian government, wherein they sought to understand the basis of the case that we brought before the ICJ. We explained it in detail. I must say that I left that meeting with an understanding that Canadian foreign policy, at least at the official level, is grappling the gravity of the matter that was going to be on which the judgment was given today. So I remained hopeful in light of the previous pronouncement of the Canadian government in this respect, that they will be supportive of the outcome of the judgment, and that will place an obligation to them as a signatory to the convention to follow up on certain action to prevent genocide. So that's the first level. I want to offer a very concrete way forward in this regard. Many countries have been saying for far too long that they support a two-state solution to the problems of Palestine and Israel. While the first beginning, the first step to meaningfully contribute to that two-state solution must be the recognition of Palestine as a state. Now, Canada needs, and Canadian government needs to, in light of this judgment and in light of its own contribution towards a two-state solution, needs to give urgent consideration to the recognition of Palestine as a state by the Canadian government. Thank you.
Thank you. I know Dylan has a follow-up, but first, Ambassador Abu Amara, your remarks.
Well, I had a communication after Prime Minister Trudeau made his initial statement in the press conference, and before the actual statement came out from Minister Joly, the conversation was mainly that what we got from that press conference from the PM was that they would stay neutral to the proceedings until they see how it goes. So I didn't have any communications after, but the understanding was that it's a neutral position. And I second my dear friend here when I spoke about the necessity not to wait for the occupier to decide if the Palestinian people deserve to have a state, and I called on Canada to recognize Palestine, and that would be a way forward for justice. And I requested dearly that if Canada does not support the proceedings and the case of South Africa, to not stand in the way of justice, not to have a negative impact like it did on other cases. So that message, I think, was received and it was portrayed in the statement, I feel. So that was a positive reaction that I got from that meeting and the statements after. But now we request a lot more of Canada after this ruling.
Thank you, Ambassador Abu Amara. Dylan.
Thank you, sorry. And I'm just wondering how each of you two would characterize the response from the Canadian government so far. I think you've pretty accurately portrayed it, that we're we're staying neutral in the case. We haven't said if we're going to respect the eventual ruling. But I'm just wondering if you would say, you know, are we failing to uphold our duty, or is this sort of par for the course? How would you characterize the sort of stance that you've been hearing from the Canadian government so far?
They haven't really said anything more than what you've heard in the press conference or in the statement, but I know that the Canadian government is put in a corner right now because of what Israel is doing on the ground. They are unable to shield them anymore, and they have their own responsibilities, and it would shed light on the credibility of what Canada preaches versus what Canada practices. So I think that's a very tough position to be in, but I hope that moving forward, Canada will do the right thing and be on the right side of history, not just as something that is good and just for the Palestinians, but also something that is necessary for its credibility in front of the world and to its own people.
Thank you, Ambassador
Well-
Abu-Amara. Sorry, Dylan? Or would any of the other speakers like to give a response to Dylan's questions, particularly about Canada's fulfillment of its legal obligations in light of the judgment today?
If I can just remark very briefly, there is a report from Global Affairs that Minister Joly spoke with the Foreign Minister of Israel yesterday, and in the printout of the exchange between the two of them, there was a long remark with respect to Minister Joly reiterating its condemnation, as it should, of the terrorist attacks on the 7th of October. But all she said with respect to what's going on in Gaza since the 7th of October was her deep concern over the humanitarian crisis faced by Palestinian civilians in Gaza, and saying that their protection is paramount. This is typical, I'm afraid, of what Canada has said, and other countries in the global north have said, that they keep on calling on Israel to abide by international humanitarian law. They don't call it out when it is in breach of international humanitarian law, as it has with respect to its efforts towards starvation, the denial of the necessities of life, the hindrance of humanitarian aid, and of course the indiscriminate bombing of Gaza.
If I could just add to that as well, if I would encourage media to read that readout between, following a meeting between Minister Joly and her new Israeli counterpart, Israel Katz, because it was quite telling in terms of, this came out yesterday, not only, as Michael mentioned, in terms of the portrayal of the humanitarian crisis. In a lot of ways, it was business as usual. A portrayal of the humanitarian suffering of Palestinians as though it was the result of a humanitarian disaster, simply a natural disaster, not at all man-made, not at all the result of Israeli human rights violations. And at the same time, what was actually very disheartening was at the end of that readout, there was a sort of commemoration of the 75-year anniversary of Canada and Israel's ties, the strong people-to-people relations, et cetera. Really unprecedented. It's hard to imagine in any other case where a country is before the International Court of Justice for serious international crimes like genocide, for Canada in a readout to celebrate its people-to-people ties with that country and its the anniversary of its bilateral relations. So there is, certainly a very urgent need to reverse course very sharply and not continue business as usual here.
Thank you. My apologies, High Commissioner Sheikh. I think you were muted before and I didn't realize, so please.
It's okay. I think we should follow what Avi has said. There was a world before the judgment, and there's a world after the judgment. And of course, the current world is going to judge every country by how it deals with this judgment. And I think that's the turning point. And I think Canada should, like all other countries, do the right thing now, recognize the judgment. This is a very important day in the development of international law. And any country who wants to claim that it practices the rule of law must abide by the decision of a court that placed certain obligations not only on Israel, it has placed certain obligations for all of us who believe that we are part of this international order. So for me, it is quite clear, and I am hopeful that Canada will abide by the decisions of the ICJ and act in accordance of being a responsible global citizen. It has no other choice but to do so.
Thank you, High Commissioner Sheikh. Now we'll take a question from Lama Agad. Lama, if you'd like to ask your question, please go ahead.
Thank you very much. First of all, I'd like to say congratulations, ambassadors, and congratulations, Palestine, and thank you, South Africa, for finally holding Israel accountable to its genocidal act and ethnic cleansing measures that has been taking place for the past decades. And I'm making that statement as a Palestinian. My question now as a journalist, do you believe, which is to both ambassadors, do you believe that the ruling of ICJ, which did not mention ceasefire, was to prevent USA from vetoing that ruling had it mentioned ceasefire? And if you want, you can answer that question and then I can do a follow-up question.
Perhaps, or do you have
Continue?
both now? Perhaps
Yeah,
ask
I
both.
have them, yeah.
Lama?
Yeah, and now that the Court of Justice has ruled, we know that the position of the Prime Minister Justin Trudeau and Minister Julie has announced that they don't support the case in one hand, but also they support the process of the ICJ, which implies that Canada will respect the decision of the court. Have you, either ambassador, received any support from any MPs from either parties, especially from the Conservatives? And do you believe this is a step forward to push Canada to finally recognize a Palestinian state under this government, especially that it's quite clear that the position of the Conservatives have been very aggressive against the Palestinians, to a point they have been excusing Israel from any war crimes they have been committing at the parliament? Thank you.
So on the question of the United States of America in regard to whether they could veto the decision of the ICJ, my understanding is that the ICJ is a court. It is independent of those acts. Now the report of the court will go before the United Nations Security Council. I would see it very difficult for the United States to veto the adoption of the order of the court. In fact, I think the order of the court is binding on participants of the convention. So the question is whether any action that the United Nations Security Council may do, and of course, I think on a positive side, and I want to be optimistic because this is also a day of hope, that the United States of America will also abide by the binding order of the court. So that is my hope. Second, in regard to Canada, I want to be fair to the government of Canada. The ruling just came out a few hours ago. I am sure that they would be considering the implications of the decision. I will hold my criticism because at this point I have none, and we would afford the Canadian government time to reflect on the consequences of the ruling. And I'm confident that there are sufficient voices of reason, there are sufficient voices who want to uphold international and humanitarian law, will be brought to bear on the Canadian government to act consistently with the judgment. In respect of other political parties, it's not for me as a representative of my country to reflect on what positions they may or may not take. But as I said before, I think a very credible demonstration towards a two-state solution for Palestine and Israel has to start from the recognition of Palestine as a state.
I just think you summed up everything I wanted to say. I second your enthusiasm and the patience because we don't know what Canada's position would be, and we'll have that talk when it happens. But I wanted to assure that when in the press conference or in the statement, neither the Prime Minister nor Minister Joly have rejected South Africa's case. They said that their acceptance and support for the ICJ does not mean that they agree with the premise. But as we've learned in international law, that does not mean that it disagrees with it either. So that's the neutrality that we got out of it with the position, the hard position that Canada is in. That's, to me, was the feeling. On the issue with the MPs, yes, I know that a lot of MPs are supportive of the ICJ's case, South Africa's case against Israel, and they push the government also to take a bolder position. On that regard, I always feel that action is much better than talk all the time. So I urge MPs every day to put down bills, to do the walk, not just the talk. So push the government to recognize Palestine, push it now to adhere to the ruling. Those ways help Palestine push to action things on the ground instead of pushing and hoping mostly. So we were hoping for neutrality before the court. Now we wish Canada to actually have a positive impact and stop the neutrality, because neutrality does not work after today.
I've got one more matter to add on this, and I think we should not pay attention to it, because the court also ruled that Hamas must release unconditionally all of the hostages that it is holding. The foreign minister of South Africa, on the outcome of this decision, made that call. The president of South Africa made that call. And I, in keeping with that, make the same call that all hostages held by Hamas should be released immediately and unconditionally, so that the peace process can no longer be held hostage to the fact that they are hostages. So we must release those prisoners so that the peace process can indeed happen.
Thank you, High Commissioner Sheikh and Ambassador Abu Amara. Would any of the other speakers like to respond to those questions as well? In the meantime, if you are a journalist and have a question, please do raise your hand and ask it. Anyone else who has a question, please come on Wednesday. You can ask all of your questions then. Today, we're just taking questions from the journalists. And so we'll have any other responses from the speakers to those questions, as well as if you would like to perhaps make a 1-minute closing statement each.
I just want to briefly respond to the scope of the implications for Canadian society. We've talked about the government of Canada, a needed change in its foreign policy, an abrupt shift from, if you parse the statements of Canadian officials and our foreign minister and prime minister, you find a lot of pro-Israel talking points in the details, as you saw, as it was pointed out in that report of the meeting Melanie Joly had that came out yesterday. The top line is kind of neutral. The rest is what we've heard from Canada for decades, which is undiluted support for Israel in the international sphere. That's got to stop. That's got to change. This changes everything today. But it doesn't just change everything at the governmental level. Public institutions across the country have to take account of this decision. On my own campus at the University of British Columbia, a couple of weeks ago, Hillel, a Zionist group on campus, brought a member of the Israeli military for a public event to quote unquote, report from what's going on the ground in Gaza. I did not attend this event. Members of Independent Jewish Voices protested outside, which I thought was important and significant in a peaceful and fierce way. But you can't imagine a member of the Russian military being invited to UBC to give an account from the ground in Ukraine and give us an update on all the wonderful things that Russia is doing in protecting civilian lives in Ukraine. It's just inconceivable. And we have to all adjust at every level in every public institution in Canada and recognize this new reality that Israel is on trial for genocide. And it has to shift the way that public institutions respond and react and how they conduct themselves on campuses. In particular, I mean, as an academic, that's a special passion of mine.
Thank you, Avi. Professor Link or Farida Daif? Otherwise, we do have another question from Andy Chung from the as a journalist. So, okay, so Andy, please ask your question. Go ahead.
Hello?
Hello, yes.
Yes, I have a question. Respond to High Commissioner Shiak. It was a very good point that South Africa make a clear announcement that Hamas also have to release the hostage, so the peace process will not be held hostage. Now, the question is, Israel can put into ICJ court, but how about Hamas? Like, who can enforce the law or the request? Like, we understand Palestinian Authority cannot put Hamas to court. So who can put Hamas to court? I'm not an expert in international law, but can ICJ also trial the other side too? So make the West, for example, Trudeau or United States, easier to accept the ruling.
Thank you, Andy.
If I
Was
could
that
jump
direct?
in, maybe
Yes,
that
please
may be
go ahead,
easy
Professor Link.
to
Yes.
do. The International Court of Justice, as described, the highest court in the UN system, adjudicates disputes between states as well as answers advisory opinion requests from various UN bodies. The proper place for an issue involving war crimes involving Hamas or a non-state party would be the International Criminal Court, and which is sometimes confused with the ICJ. The International Criminal Court is also in The Hague, but it looks at war crimes, crimes against humanity, and genocide, but involving individuals. So that's where that's the proper court and the proper location for any allegations of war crimes that may have been committed by Hamas or any other Palestinian armed group.
And could you just perhaps expand on that a little? Is that process already underway, and what has Israel's reaction been?
Sure, Israel does not recognize the jurisdiction of the International Criminal Court over any allegations of war crimes or violations of the Rome Statute of the International Criminal Court. But the International Criminal Court in February of 2021, almost 3 years ago, accepted that it had jurisdiction over the Palestinian territory, Gaza, East Jerusalem, and the West Bank, and it is currently investigating allegations of war crimes and crimes against humanity by both Hamas and by Israel, committed since 2014. So for the last 9 years, it has jurisdiction over those crimes. And people have criticized the ICC for moving like molasses on this. One may hope that the catastrophe we've seen and the allegations of war crimes over the last 3.5 months will spur the ICC to devote more resources into its investigation to be able to bring all those who are required to come to justice at the court.
Thank you for that answer, Professor Link. And so now we can just wrap up with just if anyone has any brief closing remarks they would like to make. We can go in reverse order from the order we went in before. So Avi, Lewis, Farida Daif, Michael Link, and then the High Commissioner and the Ambassador. Avi, if you would like to say anything.
Yes, I know there is, I would sort of acknowledge that there's a lot of anger out there, despite this historic decision, that the International Court of Justice didn't simply demand, as it did in the case of Russia and Ukraine, that the violence stop immediately. It should have called for a ceasefire. South Africa's provisional measures that were requested included an immediate ceasefire that was neglected by the judgment. And that's wrong. I think the reality is that there are political, that this operates in a political context. But the judges from the UK and from Germany and from France and from the United States affirmed every part of the judgment. And it seems that the court recognized its own political limits in terms of demanding an unconditional ceasefire. It should have. And Palestinians around the world are furious about that, and they should be. And the peace movement around the world is furious about that, and it should be. And we can also recognize that today was a day of days, a before and after day, that everything is different now, and that we have to act on that basis as well. But let's say the court should have called for a ceasefire. It does need to be said.
Thank you, Avi Lewis. Frida Dive.
Thanks, Aziza. For years now, Human Rights Watch has called on Canada to engage with the reality on the ground in Israel-Palestine. Several years ago, a few years ago now, we determined that reality was the reality of apartheid and persecution, something that Palestinian organizations, Israeli organizations, international organizations have also found. We called on Canada repeatedly to stop turning a blind eye to these serious international crimes by its ally, Israel, that essentially breeds impunity and breeds what we've seen over the past 3.5 months, which is a complete and devastating breakdown of international law. Today is a hopeful day, as High Commissioner Sheikh said. It finally feels like we're moving forward towards a path of justice and accountability, and we hope that Canada follows us on this path.
Thank you, Frida Dive, Canada Director, Human Rights Watch. Michael Link.
This issue of international law and Israel's failure to obey it has been long-standing. This didn't start today with this ruling coming from the International Court of Justice. The United Nations has passed resolutions for over the past 45 years saying that the annexation of occupied territory is illegal, that settlements are illegal, that this is an occupation, and the Fourth Geneva Convention winds up applying, that the Palestinians have the right to self-determination, and that Israel has been in violation of many parts of international conventions on human rights and humanitarian law. I would call this ruling today a glass of water that's 3/4 full. It gave most of the needed provisional measures requested by Israel. It didn't give the clear direction with respect to a ceasefire. I think the only way to fulfill the provisional measures that have been issued is by a ceasefire, but I fear that Israel will use the lack of a definitive, explicit call for a ceasefire to continue what it's been doing. But as I think the theme we've all been talking about is one of accountability. This occupation has gone on as long as it has, 56 years and counting, because there's been an utter lack of accountability, primarily coming from countries in the global north with respect to this. This becomes a case of international law for thee, but not for me. In the Middle East, it's been said that international law has been closer to power than it has been to justice. And I can't help but reflect on my own experience as a UN Special Rapporteur on this issue. If international law had been followed rigorously 40 years ago, 30 years ago, or even 20 years ago, we would not be in the situation today where we're using the word apartheid and we're using the word genocide. We would have had a free Palestinian state by now. But international law has been pushed to the sidelines, and let's hope that this is a turning point. This is a new threshold where international law will now be rigorously obeyed and applied in the Middle East.
Thank you, Professor Link. And we would also note that there is currently also before the International Court of Justice an advisory case on whether Israel's occupation of the Palestinian territories is illegal. And so for future and further analysis on that, stay tuned as well. High Commissioner Sheikh and Ambassador Abu Amara.
Our side, we want to make clear that this was not a one-event process. We are committed to doing everything in the power as a country and as a government to ensure that justice will prevail for the Palestinian people. And we would hold, by the ruling of the court, we will hold Israel to account within 30 days in respect of the measures that they have to implement, and we will not stop, and we will continue holding up the mirror for them to account by the provisional agreements until Palestine is free.
I want to add to what Avi said. I agree. The court fell short from calling for a total ceasefire, and the Palestinians in Gaza deserve that. It didn't explicitly say it, but our feeling and why we're happy, even with this, first of all, to be heard, to be recognized, to be seen as people who have been tortured, and to have that be investigated. That's something that every Palestinian hold very close to their heart. In addition, we believe that ruling was crafted very, very well, taking into consideration the political issues that Avi spoke of, that Israel would not be able in any shape or form, I would steal my colleague Ammar's statement, in any shape or form to implement this ruling without stopping, seizing all of its aggressions, all of its atrocities. Because to us, the war, the aggression that Israel is committing is not against Hamas, it's against the Palestinian people as a whole. It's the extension, it's Nakba 2.0, which is much now invented in a way that it creates so much more damage to finish the job that the godfathers of the Zionist project were not able to do in 1948 and ever since. So for us, this is not the end. This is simply the beginning of many more of those moments, hopefully, where we will get to justice, and it will come. And we wish that those countries around us, the allies of Israel, those who are calling for human rights and rules-based order, would actually recognize that they need to implement it, even when it's their friend and ally committing those atrocities and genocide. Thank you.
Thank you, Ambassador Abu Amara, High Commissioner Sheikh. Many, many thanks to all our speakers. Great thanks to all of you who have joined us here today in the wake of this momentous ruling, and also deepest gratitude to all of those whose hard work made today's press conference possible. Karen Rudman from Just Peace Advocates, Bianca Mugeni and Eve Engler from Canadian Foreign Policy Institute, Enver Domingo, and everyone else who helped to pull this together. As we said, stay tuned for the webinar on Wednesday. I also want to reiterate what Just Peace Advocates and Canadian Foreign Policy Institute's demands are, which are for Canada to withdraw all forms of military, financial, and political and moral complicity in the genocide, including through curtailing aid through military relationships, through charitable donations, and Canadian participation in the Israeli military. And if you would like to sign a letter to the government calling for these things, you can check that out on the Just Peace Advocates website. If, as a journalist, you have any follow-up questions or interview requests for any of our speakers today, Karen has just posted the email address info@justpeaceadvocates.ca that you can contact, and we can arrange that throughout the day. So thank you again to everyone for joining us today as we all work together to bring life and make a reality of this very significant ruling that we've had at the International Court of Justice today. Thank you, everyone, and have